If you've ever thought about a friend of yours, only for them to call you moments later, you might think that there's a deeper meaning behind it. Or perhaps you see it as a mere coincidence. These types of events happen thousands of times every day, and yet we still don't know whether they hold any real significance, or if they're in no way connected. Led Zeppelin is undoubtedly one of the most famous rock bands in all of history. Their most iconic song, Stairway to Heaven, caused a lot of stir after it was released, as some people believe it had ties to Satanism. While Stairway to Heaven may be the first song that comes to mind when the band is mentioned, they had a long and successful run in the music industry, and today the band is seen as legendary among classic rock music fans. But not many people know that they played their first ever show under a different name. The band's guitarist, Jimmy Page, played for a band called the Yardbirds for 2 years before Led Zeppelin was formed, and in 1968 the other 3 members of this band decided to call it quits. Upon their departure, they left the rights to the band name to the band's manager, Peter Grant, and to Page, who immediately started looking for new musicians to take their place. He ended up recruiting singer Robert Plant, bassist John Paul Jones, and drummer John Bonham. And when they played their first show later that year, they were listed on the bill as the Yardbirds. But Plant was not the first choice to become the band's vocalist. He first considered the vocalist of the band Peter J. and the Jaywalkers, Terry Reid, but Reid was unavailable at the time and he suggested that Page get in touch with Plant, which turned out to be a great decision. John Bonham, who's considered by many to be one of the greatest drummers of all time, also wasn't Page's first choice on percussion, but it would be hard to imagine the band without his unique style. Quite unbelievably, Bonham never took any formal drumming lessons. He taught himself to play the drums from the age of 5 when he used common household items such as a bath salt container and an empty coffee tin to figure out different rudiments. He didn't own a drum kit until he was 15 years old, and later explained that he never showed an interest in taking lessons because he felt the feeling was far more important than technique, since it helps you create your own unique sound rather than learning the same lessons as every other drummer and ending up sounding just like them. His signature sound is perhaps best noted in the band's song Black Dog, which is about a dog that the band used to see walking around the Headley Grange studio grounds at night while they were recording there. They noticed that it would head out onto the grounds every night and then return in the morning, tired and slightly worse for wear, before repeating the same routine again the following day. The song is iconic for the fact that it uses an odd time signature compared to the guitar track. The drums are played in a normal 4/4 beat, while the guitar is played in 5/4, giving it a strange feel that has left many amateur drummers baffled. He's also the subject of a strange coincidence that took place at his grave when it was visited by a journalist from the Guardian newspaper. The grave is located at St. Michael's Church in Rushock, Worcestershire, England. Upon his arrival there, the photographer walked over to the gravestone, which is inscribed with the words, "He will always be remembered in our hearts. Good night, my love. God bless." But to his surprise, as he started taking a few photos, a black dog emerged as if out of nowhere, walked over to the grave, relieved itself, and then abruptly disappeared into the distance again. Michael Jackson, the enigmatic singer who remains a household name many years after his passing, was born on the 29th of August, 1958. He grew up in Gary, Indiana, and as most of us know, had a turbulent childhood. As a child, he sang with his brothers in a group called the Jackson 5, who were eventually signed to the Tamla Motown record label. But in 1970, he set out on his own to begin a solo career that would take the world by storm. His first solo album, entitled Bad, was released in 1987, and it was hugely successful. What followed was a career that most artists could only dream of, as he released album after album to rave reviews, and before long he had one of the biggest fan bases on the planet. He became known as the King of Pop, and today many still regard him as the biggest musical superstar of all time. His album Thriller is still the biggest selling record of all time, as it sold over 70 million copies in the 40 years since its release. He's also featured in the Guinness Book of World Records as the pop star who supported more charities than any other, the most Grammy Awards won in a single year, and as the most successful artist of all time. He was known to be an incredible dancer with his signature move, the moonwalk, becoming famous in 1983, after he performed it on the Motown 25th anniversary special while performing his song Billie Jean. During his long career, he won 13 Grammy Awards and was nominated a staggering 26 times, leading to over 500 million album sales throughout the years. But he was, however, also seen as a controversial figure at times, as he was very eccentric and lived in near isolation. It's been suggested that his bizarre behavior was brought on by an unfortunate accident that coincidentally occurred exactly halfway through his life, and it left him traumatized for years after the fact. On the 27th of January, 1984, Michael was shooting a commercial for Pepsi at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, and during one take, something went horribly wrong. A pyrotechnic didn't fire the way it was supposed to, and unbeknownst to Jackson, the hair on the very top of his head was alight. It's believed that his hair gel and spray only fueled the fire further, and at first the crowd in attendance, as well as the filming crew, thought that it was part of the shot, but they were mistaken. Jackson kept dancing to the music, blissfully unaware of what was happening, until he started to feel pain on his scalp. When he started frantically trying to put out the flames by swatting at his head, crew members finally realized it wasn't part of the act, and they jumped in to assist. He suffered second and third degree burns to his scalp and underwent several surgeries as a result. It's believed that due to the incident, he became dependent on painkillers, and as the years passed, he would then become addicted to several other types of medication, leading many to believe that this incident played a crucial part in his strange behavior in the latter years of his life. People have also pointed out a strange coincidence regarding the incident: the fact that he was 25 years, 4 months, and 29 years old on that very day, and he would go on to live another 25 years, 4 months, and 29 days, meaning that this turning point came exactly at the halfway point of his life. The human body is an astonishing thing. For all that we've learned about our own physiology over the centuries, there are still many occurrences that we're unable to explain, such as why a person would suddenly be cured of a disease without receiving any treatment. Another good example concerns a 22-year-old woman named Jean Haynes, who was born with almost no hearing at all. She was forced to cope with life as a deaf child, but by the time she was an adult, she'd grown accustomed to it. But one day she had an allergic reaction to plastic foam, which triggered a bout of sneezing. This went on for almost 6 hours, until finally she gave one big sneeze, and to her disbelief, she could hear perfectly fine, and her hearing remained intact thereafter. Then there's the curious case of Edwin Robinson, who at the age of 53 was involved in a truck accident, during which he sustained a head injury. In the months following the incident, he started noticing that his eyesight was deteriorating, as was his hearing. It became apparent that some kind of damage had been done, and he'd had to come to terms with the fact that he would eventually go blind and deaf. He had a hearing aid fitted and started learning to read Braille in preparation, and before long he did indeed lose his eyesight. Then, 9 years later, a storm started rolling in at his hometown in Falmouth in Maine, and he realized that his pet chicken was still outside. Worried that she'd get caught in the rain, he ventured outside using his aluminum cane to get around and started calling for the chicken that would always come running when she heard his voice. He then made his way under one of the trees in his yard, and before he knew it, he was knocked unconscious. When he came to after about 20 minutes of unconsciousness, he was at a loss as to what had happened at first, but he soon realized that he'd been struck by a lightning bolt thanks to the storm that had arrived. He walked back to the house, rattled by the experience, and decided to lay down. Before long, he fell asleep, and when he woke up, he realized that he no longer had the strange sensation that he'd been living with for the last 9 years, which was feeling as though he was always wearing a baseball hat. In the days that followed, he realized he could read the time on his wall clock, though it would come in and out of focus. The next day, he saw his cat for the first time in 9 years, and his neighbor was shocked to see Edwin walking down his driveway without the aid of his cane. Before long, he started regaining his hearing, and just a few weeks later, he didn't need it at all anymore. Doctors were completely baffled by the incident, but confirmed that Edwin was indeed no longer blind or deaf. John Wayne Gacy and Jeffrey Dahmer are two of the most notorious and famous serial killers to have ever lived. They both committed atrocious crimes against their victims, but were ultimately caught and made to pay for what they had done. Gacy was born in Chicago on the 17th of March, 1942. In the early 70s, he started working as a building contractor, but in his spare time, he appeared as Pogo the Clown at children's parties. At the same time, he was luring men to his house just outside of Chicago, where he would end their lives before disposing of their bodies. He first appeared on authorities' radar when Robert Priest went missing in Des Plaines. And in December of 1978, his house was searched, and the remains of some of his victims were found in the crawl space under the house. He was arrested and charged with the crime, and as the investigation continued, it quickly became apparent that he had many more victims, as many as 33. In March of 1980, he was found guilty of 33 murders and handed the death penalty. 14 years later, he was executed on the 10th of May, 1994, a date that coincides with two other notable events, one involving Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer was born in Milwaukee in 1960, and from a young age he started exhibiting some worrying behavior. Despite this, he was reasonably popular in school since he enjoyed playing pranks and acting like the class clown. He ended the life of his first victim when he was just 18 years old in 1978. The crimes are too graphic to describe, but all in all, he ended the lives of 17 men over the course of 13 years before he was finally apprehended in 1991. He was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution to serve the 16 life sentences that he'd received. But on the 28th of November, 1994, he was on his way to work detail when a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, attacked him with a metal bar and ended his life along with another inmate's. But not many people are aware that Dahmer attempted to turn his life around while incarcerated, often being seen with a Bible in his hands and visiting with a minister named Roy Radcliffe. He would eventually ask Radcliffe to baptize him, which he did on the 10th of May, 1994. In a bizarre coincidence that was later pointed out, this is the very day that John Wayne Gacy was executed. And to make matters even more ominous, it was also the same day that a solar eclipse took place. Many see this as more than just a coincidence, since it marked the end of the life of one serial killer, but also the rebirth of another who had chosen to turn to Christianity in the aftermath of the horrible acts that he had carried out. The two events may not truly be linked, but to many it serves as a reminder that even those who we consider to be the most wicked have the opportunity to change the path they're on before it's too late. We all know that winning the lottery is a most unlikely event. Even if someone were to buy a ticket for every lottery draw in their lifetime, the chances are that they'll never win the big prize. And even if they do, they might have to split it with several other winners who chose the same numbers. Nevertheless, millions of people play the lottery in their respective countries every week in hopes that they'll strike it lucky by winning a life-changing amount of money. And sometimes this does happen. On the 7th of November 2022, a man named Edwin Castro won the US's largest lottery jackpot, a staggering $2.04 billion, after buying a Powerball ticket from Joe's service station in Altadena, California. Unsurprisingly, no other details about the winner were released. But sometimes the lottery draw can cause some controversy. In October of 2022, people in Singapore bought their Grand Lotto tickets in hopes of winning 236 million Philippine pesos, which converts to about $4 million US. When the numbers were drawn later that evening, people were surprised to find that all the numbers were multiples of 9, namely 9, 18, 27, 36, 45, and 54. It seemed like an uncannily strange event, and immediately people started calling for an investigation, since the chances of this ever happening were extremely low. But there was another surprise in store regarding the same draw. When the results of the draw were announced, people were even more taken aback when they learned that 440 people had played those exact numbers, and that they would all be sharing part of the jackpot. This was the first time that such a high number of people had won the Grand Lotto, and they each walked away with about 545,000 pesos, the equivalent of about $9,000, a far cry from the $4 million that would have been paid to a single winner. People were immediately suspicious that the draw had been fixed somehow, and the Philippine Charity Sweepstakes Office launched an investigation. Once the winners started coming forward and being identified, it became clear that there had been no tampering and that the uncanny numbers that had been drawn were mere coincidence. But many people remained skeptical, not only because the numbers were multiples of 9, but because they found it hard to believe that so many people would choose to play these 6 numbers, since it would severely reduce their chances of winning anything at all. Nonetheless, the money was paid out, and the Philippine government released a statement saying that the matter had been put to rest and that there would be no further investigation. Sachin Tendulkar and Virat Kohli are 2 cricketers who are best known for representing their country of India during their long and prolific careers. They're both seen as among the best batsmen the game has ever seen, and both have captained India at some point in their lives. The Indian team has been a dominant force in cricket for many decades, and the country has produced some of the greatest bowlers and batsmen of all time. But the team is also the subject of a series of strange coincidences that sometimes seem too good to be true. In 1999, a batsman called Sourav Ganguly put in an incredible performance with the bat, scoring a total of 183 runs during his innings against Sri Lanka. Not long after this, it was announced that he would become the team's captain. Then in 2005, Mahendra Singh Dhoni was part of the Indian team that again was playing against Sri Lanka when he also scored 183 runs in a single inning, leading to the decision to crown him as India's captain. 7 years later, in 2012, Virat Kohli was included in the squad that faced off against Pakistan, and he showed his talents by also scoring 183 runs while at the crease. In the months that followed, he was made the team captain, following in the footsteps of 2 of the greatest Indian players of all time. Scoring 100 runs in one game, known to cricket fans as a century, is no mean feat, but scoring a double century is even rarer and reserved for only the best batsmen out there. This does happen in Test cricket, which is a 5-day contest now and then, but a double hundred is exceedingly rare in one-day cricket, since the batting team only has a limited time to score as many runs as they can. But it's not unheard of. In 2010, Sachin Tendulkar became the first batsman ever to achieve this feat, scoring exactly 200 against the South African team. As is often the way with sports though, another batsman, Virendra Sehwag, also scored a double century just 1 year later, this time against the West Indies. He would eventually end his innings having scored 219. The third person to achieve this feat was Rohit Sharma, who scored 209 runs against Australia in 2013. He would go on to make the highest individual score in a one-day international match just a year later with a score of 264. What makes this so remarkable is that all 3 of these batsmen, the first 3 to ever score double hundreds, were all Indian players, but the coincidences between Indian players don't end there. 2 of the game's biggest stars, Sachin Tendulkar and Virat Kohli, share a set of statistics that's almost too unlikely to be true. Both players scored a total of 1,000 runs against Australia on the same date, the 28th of September, though they completed this feat years apart. But their 1,000th run came at the same ground, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, when they were 29 years old. It took them the same number of innings to get there, 19, and the same number of test matches, 11. They'd each scored 5 centuries and 2 half-centuries, which is 50 runs, during their careers up to that point. It's a coincidence that's unlikely to ever be repeated, despite thousands of international and domestic games being played around the world every year. The Hoover Dam is a very important man-made dam that lies on the border between Nevada and Arizona. It controls the flooding of the Colorado River, is the source of irrigation for about 1.5 acres of land, and provides more than 16 million people with water. It's situated in the Colorado River's Black Canyon, but was also originally slated to be in Boulder Canyon, leading to its construction being called the Boulder Canyon Project, even after it was decided that Black Canyon would be a better location. After construction of the dam was completed, it was announced that it would be named the Hoover Dam after President Herbert Hoover, the U.S.'s 31st president. But when Franklin Roosevelt became president, he decided to change the name to Boulder Dam, since Hoover's name had become synonymous with the Great Depression. The name was finally changed back to Hoover Dam in 1947, when the then president, Harry Truman, approved a congressional resolution to that effect. While it was being built, the 5,000 construction workers lived in Boulder City, an area containing housing and other amenities that was built on federal land. Many of the men working on the project had been jobless up to this point and had been living in squalid conditions until they were given the opportunity to help construct the massive dam. Construction of the dam resulted in the entire community of St. Thomas in Nevada being flooded. People living there had no choice but to relocate, and before long it was completely abandoned, with the last resident leaving in 1938. At one point, it was the tallest dam that had ever been constructed, standing at 726 feet high. In modern times, it's the second tallest dam in the United States, exceeded only by Oroville Dam, which is located in North California. Not many people know that the dam was almost destroyed during the Second World War. It came to light that German agents were hatching a plan to place explosive at the dam's intake towers, which, if the plan had been followed through with, would have disrupted the electricity supply to Southern California's aviation manufacturing industry. The plan was never carried out as strict security measures were quickly put in place, including the prohibition of private boats near the dam. When it was completed, it was seen as a true marvel of engineering, but its construction came at a cost, as many people lost their lives, including 2 people who were part of a strange coincidence. On the 20th of December, 1921, a man named John Gregory Tierney was part of a surveying team that was scouting different areas where the dam would be constructed. But he became the first casualty of the project when a flash flood occurred and he was swept away by the current. Despite this, his son Patrick Tierney decided to apply for a job as a construction worker at the dam, a decision that he would come to regret 14 years after his father had lost his life, thanks to the project. On the 20th of December, 1935, 3 months before the dam was officially completed, and 14 years to the day after his father lost his life in the flood, Patrick slipped and fell from one of the dam's intake towers, becoming the last person to lose his life in the dam's construction, just as his father had been the first. The chances of a single person winning the Powerball lottery in the US is about 292 million to 1. This means that you're far more likely to be hit by lightning than become a lottery winner. And yet, most of us have chanced our luck and purchased a ticket at some point in our lives, just in case. Some people who play the lottery regularly claim to have a system that they follow for every draw. Some people prefer even or odd numbers. Others choose numbers other than the ones that appeared during the previous draw, while others use numbers such as their birth dates, or even digits appearing in their address or phone number. In truth, there's no way of telling whether your numbers will appear during a draw, and these types of systems have been labeled as mere superstition. Nevertheless, many people believe some numbers to be lucky, and they rarely stray from picking them. Some lottery winners are happy to do a quick pick, where numbers are randomly produced and not actually chosen by the player. Many feel this is the best way to play the lottery since it's all left up to chance. But once someone is set in their ways, it's hard to convince them to change, as is evidenced by an incident that took place in China in December of 2023. It involves a man who lived in the country's Jiangxi province, who played the lottery every chance he got, but he always chose the same numbers. For the draw that took place on the 2nd of December of that year, he decided to buy 100,000 yuan worth of Happy 8 lottery tickets, which converted to about $14,000. He felt that purchasing such a large number of tickets would exponentially improve his chances of at least winning something, and if he was lucky, he might win the jackpot. He didn't buy the tickets in one location, but chose to visit several stores around the city, which is not unheard of. But what makes his story so coincidental is the fact that he chose the same number for each of the tickets: 40, 41, 42, 44, 63, 64, and 65, and they all contained these winning numbers. Understandably, people grew suspicious when the story broke, and they started alleging that he must have had insider information, since the event was so unbelievably unlikely. Each of the tickets saw the man who has not been named win $600, and when all the tickets were accounted for, he became an instant multimillionaire. Upon collecting his winnings, the man revealed that he'd been employing the same tactic for the last 5 years, and that he bought tickets 4 or 5 times a week. It's believed that he spent up to $1 million on tickets over the years, but when it finally paid off, it was money well spent. Stephen Hawking, arguably the most iconic scientist of the modern era, was born on the 8th of January 1942. He was one of 4 children who grew up in Oxfordshire, England. His parents both had scientific backgrounds, since his father worked as a research biologist and his mother was a medical research secretary, instilling a love of science in him from a young age. As he grew older, he started showing interest in physics and math, since he wanted to learn as much as he could about how the world works and thought that these subjects would be the most apt. He studied at Oxford, where he was an average student, after which he obtained his PhD from Cambridge University. He met his wife Jane at a New Year's party, but before they got married, he was diagnosed with ALS. Knowing that the condition would likely shorten his life, they decided to get married as soon as possible. He eventually started walking with a cane, but would not let his condition get in the way of his work, which he still took on with the same passion as ever. Eventually, he was no longer able to write, and so he started visualizing his work in his mind, and many of his fellow scientists felt that this way of working afforded him the chance to solve some of the universe's biggest mysteries. He started focusing mostly on black holes, and before long he proposed the theory that black holes are the exact opposite of the Big Bang, and hence that the math he used to prove this also proved that the Big Bang may have actually happened, a suggestion that's still refuted by many scientists even in modern times. In 1979, he was chosen as the professor of mathematics at Cambridge University, a coveted position that's held by some of our greatest scientists, such as Isaac Newton. By this point, he'd made use of a wheelchair since he could no longer walk, but he defied the odds by living a decade longer than predicted. By 1985, he was no longer able to speak, but made use of a speech synthesizer that would sound out the words he wanted to say. 3 years later, he published his book, A Brief History of Time, proving that his mind was as sharp as ever despite his physical difficulties. In 1995, he and Jane got divorced, and he married his longtime nurse, Elaine Mason. They remained married for the next 11 years, but eventually his illness became too much and they divorced. He made many more contributions to the scientific community until March of 2018 when he passed away. It's a date that many people see as significant, since it coincides with 2 other notable events, though most people think of it merely as a coincidence. Hawking lost his life on the 14th of March 2018, the same day that another famous scientist, Albert Einstein, was born, but 139 years after the fact. But this isn't the only coincidence as far as the date is concerned. Pi Day is celebrated on the 14th of March, since the date contains the first digits of pi, 314. Since pi is a very important number in mathematics, the fact that Hawking passed away on that day is celebrated as somewhat serendipitous. While his fellow scientists don't consider the date of Hawking's passing to be in any way significant, many have stated that it is indeed a happy coincidence, and one that Hawking himself would have certainly found most entertaining. Father and son Bruce and Brandon Lee left an indelible mark on the film industry, albeit for very different reasons. Bruce starred in many martial arts films, since he was considered to be one of the best martial artists the world has ever seen, along with the likes of Chuck Norris. He was born in San Francisco in the Chinese Year of the Dragon, on the Day of the Dragon, but his parents called him by a female nickname, Little Phoenix, since they'd lost a son in the past, and according to Chinese tradition, their second son would be safe if he were called by a female name, since the spirit that took their first son would be confused by this. As for Brandon, he was born in the Year of the Dragon, and he followed in his father's footsteps by not only becoming a very good martial artist in his own right, but by becoming a film star, just as his father had. But neither man would live to see old age, since Bruce lost his life in 1973 at the age of 32, and Brandon passed away when he was 28 in 1993. Due to the strange circumstances surrounding each of their deaths, some people believe in the existence of the curse of the Lees, since there are some striking similarities not only regarding their lives but also their deaths. At the time of their respective passing, both men were in the process of filming their 5th movie. Game of Death, a film starring Bruce Lee, was in post-production when he suffered a cerebral edema. It was reported that this was the result of a bad reaction to a painkiller that he had taken, but not everyone was convinced. Some people speculated that he may have been taking illegal substances, that he suffered a stroke, or that his life had been ended by Hong Kong Triad members. Even stranger was the fact that Bruce's last film, Game of Death, seemed to predict the passing of his son. In the film, Bruce's character pretends to pass away after being fired at with a prop firearm, an incident that would actually occur years later, resulting in Brandon losing his life. At the time, Brandon was filming the cult classic horror film The Crow, in which he plays a character that's brought back to life to take revenge on a gang of criminals who ended his life and that of his fiancée on Halloween night. In one of the opening scenes, Brandon's character arrives at his and his fiancée's apartment, where he discovers that she's being assaulted by the gang, and he tries to intervene. But he's soon overpowered, and one of the gang members ends his life with a firearm. Sadly, the prop used in the scene wasn't loaded with the correct fake ammunition, and a piece of shrapnel hit him in the abdomen. He was rushed to the hospital but lost his life a few hours later due to heart failure brought about by internal injuries. Fans of the Lees are still struck by this uncanny coincidence, but while some think it shows some kind of deeper meaning, most believe it's an unfortunate coincidence that no one could have predicted. Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy are considered to be two of the best American presidents of all time. While they may have lived in very different eras, they each had a profound impact on the country, and at the time of their passing were as popular as ever. Lincoln is probably best remembered for abolishing slavery in January of 1863. This enabled African American men to serve in the U.S. military for the first time, and before his passing, he advocated that they should also have the right to vote. He was also at the helm during the Civil War, but as the war was about to end, he became the first president to be assassinated, an event that rocked the country in April of 1865. But he wasn't just a politician, as he's still the only president to hold a patent. He invented a device that could be used to lift boats out of the water if obstructions were present. His Gettysburg Address speech, which he delivered in November of 1863, is one of the most famous in the history of the country, and has been reprinted thousands of times over the decades. As for Kennedy, he made his thoughts on communism very clear from the moment that he was inaugurated as president, and opposed it the entire time that he served as president. He was also the youngest person to ever be elected as president at just 43 years of age. He was the only president to assign one of his siblings to a position in a cabinet. His brother Robert served as Attorney General, while the other Ted was elected as a U.S. Senator. In 1957, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his biography, which was entitled Profiles in Courage. But not everyone knows that there are some striking coincidences between these two presidents, starting with the fact that both their surnames contain 7 letters, but this is by far the least impressive. Each of these presidents was elected to Congress and the presidency exactly 100 years apart, as Lincoln entered Congress in 1846 and became president in 1860, while Kennedy's dates for these positions are 1946 and 1960. They were both involved in the Civil Rights Movement, albeit Lincoln is said to have had more of a vested interest. Both were succeeded by vice presidents who hailed from the South and whose surnames were Johnson, Andrew Johnson and Lyndon B. Johnson. Both Lincoln and Kennedy suffered tragedies, as they each lost a son while they were serving as president. But it's the events surrounding their respective assassinations that most people find inexplicably coincidental. They both lost their lives to attacks from behind a firearm, both being hit in the head in the process. Each of these attacks took place on a Friday, and they would lose their lives in hospitals with the initials of PH. Lincoln passed away at Peterson House, and Kennedy lost his life at Parkland Hospital. The attack on Lincoln took place in Ford's Theater, and Kennedy was attacked while riding in a Ford vehicle, a Lincoln convertible to be precise. Both men were in the presence of their wives when the attacks took place, but it gets even weirder from here. Each of their assassins were known by 3 names: John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald. Each of these names contained 15 letters, and both assassins lost their lives before they could stand trial for their crimes. When we read about objects that are supposedly cursed, we usually conjure up images of ancient artifacts that were uncovered after thousands of years, haunted dolls, or objects that have been removed from a graveyard, for example. But there is one object that's said to be cursed, but it fits none of these descriptions. In this case, the object in question is a screenplay called Atuk, which was adapted from the novel The Incomparable Atuk, which was written by an author called Mordecai Richler in 1963. It was then adapted for the big screen by screenwriter Todd Carroll in 1977. The protagonist of the screenplay is a native Alaskan man called Atuk, who wants nothing more than to experience the world outside of his hometown on Baffin Island. Then one day, a documentarian called Michelle Ross visits the village to film, and upon seeing her for the first time, Atuk immediately falls in love. When she leaves, Atuk hides in her plane and travels to Canada, where he's discovered, but it's too late to send him back to Alaska, and Michelle takes him with her to New York. Here, he learns that a real estate mogul, who is also Michelle's boss, is planning on building a city in Alaska's wilderness. But he has a lot of pushback from environmentalists. At one point, Atuk saves the mogul's son from drowning, and they become friends. Atuk starts working for the mogul and is placed in a commercial for the real estate development. But he soon realizes that he's being used after the filming of the commercial, and convinced all the investors in the project to abandon it. He then goes back to Alaska, but is asked by Michelle to accompany her to Hawaii, which he does, and the screenplay comes to an end. The first person asked to look at the script was the well-known actor John Belushi in 1982. Not long after reading the script, 33-year-old Belushi passed away from the use of illegal substances, and the project ground to a halt. In 1988, plans for the film were revised, and comedian Sam Kinison was offered the leading role. United Artists backed the film, and production was started, but Kinison had his own ideas as to the creative control on the set, causing the entire production to come to a halt once again. He was later sued by United Artists, who felt that he intentionally sabotaged the project. 4 years later, Kinison lost his life in California after he was struck by a car that was being driven by an intoxicated driver. For the next 6 years, the screenplay lay dormant, and in 1994, John Candy was asked to take part in the movie. He read through the script and agreed to play the main character, but just 4 months later, he passed away after suffering a heart attack. The last actor to be affected by what many think is a curse is Chris Farley. Farley was a massive fan of Belushi's, and when he was asked to play the role that his idol couldn't, he readily agreed to read the script. By all accounts, he was on the verge of accepting the role when he, just like Belushi, lost his life to illegal substances, also in Chicago. While there's no way to prove it, the screenplay quickly gained a reputation for being cursed, and there are currently no plans for the film to be made. Ryan Johansson and Seth Jones are both well-known NHL hockey players, but they were also involved in a strange coincidence that no one could have seen coming, and it left fans amazed when they found out about it. Johansson started his hockey-playing days in the Greater Vancouver region of Canada, and eventually started playing for the Penticton Vees in the British Columbia Hockey League. He then moved to the Western Hockey League after being signed by the Portland Winterhawks. Following this, he became the 4th overall pick in the 2010 NHL Draft for the Columbus Blue Jackets. He would remain with the team for 5 seasons, after which he was traded to the Nashville Predators. He took part in 7 consecutive playoff series with Nashville, and in 2017 played with that team in the Stanley Cup Finals, which they lost to the Pittsburgh Penguins. He was then traded to the Colorado Avalanche team and eventually played for the Philadelphia Flyers. In 2015, he was chosen as the All-Star Game VIP, and has been lauded for his commitment to the game during his long career. Unfortunately, he's suffered a hip injury that's put his career in jeopardy, and only time will tell whether he will return to the ice. Seth Jones started playing hockey when he was 8 years old. From 2006 to 2007, he took part in the Quebec International Pee Wee hockey tournaments, representing different Colorado teams. When he was 12, he relocated to Texas, and he then decided to play for the U.S. National Team Development Program. He represented the Dallas Stars Bantam Major team, during which time he scored 33 times in just 31 games. He was then chosen to play for the Everett Silvertips, but stayed in Dallas for another season. He then joined the NTDP and continued to impress. He was then moved to the Portland Winterhawks team and made his NHL debut with the Nashville Predators in 2013. He was then traded to the Columbus Blue Jackets in 2016, and in 2021 was traded to the Chicago Blackhawks, with whom he signed an 8-year contract worth $76 million. Many people are surprised to learn that his father, Popeye Jones, was an NBA power forward and currently serves as assistant coach for the Denver Nuggets. But the coincidence between these two players took place in 2016 when they were each traded for the other's team. Jones was traded to the Blue Jackets while Johansson moved to the Nashville Predators. Each of the men took their respective flights to their new cities, but as luck or coincidence would have it, they bumped into each other during their journeys when they arrived at Port Columbus Airport in Ohio at the same time. They later stated that they spent some time chatting about their respective new teams and cities. Jones asked whether Johansson wanted to take over his apartment in Nashville, to which he agreed, and the two then went their separate ways. Saturday Night Live has been on the air since October of 1975, and since then it's become a household name around the world. Fans have been tuning into the show every Saturday night since then, and the show has seen some of the biggest stars of the big and small screens making appearances over the years. But it's also said to be the source of a series of coincidences, or as some people call it, a curse. It's said that when someone appears on the show and then decides to leave the cast, they may be affected by the curse that might just result in them losing their life. The first person said to be a victim of the curse is John Belushi, who is a founding member of the show. He appeared on SNL for 4 seasons, but in 1978 decided to pursue other avenues, and 4 years later he passed away. Next was Andy Kaufman, who was one of the actors who appeared in the show's very first episode. He enjoyed a 7-year stint on SNL, but in 1982 he was voted off forever by viewers, and in 1984 he passed away from lung cancer. The next victim was actress Gilda Radner, who was known for playing 2 characters, Baba Wawa and Roseanne Rosanna. She appeared on the show between 1975 and 1978, but then decided to concentrate on her stand-up comedy career. She passed away in 1989 after battling ovarian cancer. In 1985, Denitra Vance joined the SNL cast, becoming the first African-American woman to become a regular. But she struggled to connect with the show and decided to leave after the 1986 season. She lost her life to breast cancer in 1994. Michael O'Donoghue, also a founding member of the show, along with Belushi, appeared in the very first sketch that ever aired. In 1994, he suffered a stroke that unfortunately claimed his life. Chris Farley joined the cast in 1990 and remained there until 1995, with one of his most famous sketches being Chip and Dale's, which he performed with Patrick Swayze. He left the cast in 1995 to follow his acting career, but he lost his life just 2 years later. Phil Hartman quickly became a fan favorite when he joined SNL in 1998. He enjoyed an 8-year run on the show, often portraying an ex-US President Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan. But he left the cast in 1993 when he was given the chance to star in the sitcom News Radio. Then in 1998, he lost his life after he was attacked with a firearm by his wife, who was under the influence of alcohol and illegal substances, making him the 7th person said to be a victim of the curse. The last of the actors affected by the curse is Charles Rocket, who appeared on the show for 1 season from 1980 to 1981. During his time there, he caused some controversy when he used a restricted word while ad-libbing at the end of one of the episodes. This resulted in many fans protesting his presence on the cast, and he was eventually let go. Following his stint on SNL, he had a lucrative acting career, but passed away in the field near his house in Connecticut in 2005. Actor Josh Ryan Evans had a tough time growing up. He was born with a type of dwarfism that affected his heart. As a result, he underwent several surgeries while still very young. But it came with an upside. He spent a lot of time watching movies and TV shows while recovering, and as a result made up his mind that he wanted to be an actor one day. During the 1990s, he appeared in several ads and landed roles on the courtroom drama Ally McBeal, and as an actor on Nickelodeon shows. He landed his first movie role in 1999 when he was cast as a toddler in the film Baby Geniuses. He then portrayed the role of a character called General Tom Thumb in the miniseries P.T. Barnum, and in 1997 he appeared in the drama series Seventh Heaven. Next, he provided voiceovers for characters in Poltergeist: The Legacy, and for a 3rd grade character in the very popular kids show Hey Arnold, which has become somewhat of a cult classic. Then in 2000, he shot to fame after being cast in the film How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which starred Jim Carrey. He played the part of the young Grinch and was only supposed to play a small role, but after the director Ron Howard met with him, he was so impressed that he saw a lot more screen time. Being on the set was tough since he had to spend 5.5 hours having his makeup applied each day, but stated that he enjoyed working on the film, and with Howard, who thought he brought a new element to the movie. The following year, he landed what was arguably his best remembered role when he was cast as Timmy Lennox, a living doll that appeared in the soap opera Passions. In the show, Timmy was created by a witch called Tabitha, who then turns him into a living doll. This role saw him receive several awards, amongst which were Favorite Scene Stealer and Outstanding Male Scene Stealer at the Soap Opera Digest Awards. In 2000, he was nominated for a Daytime Emmy Award, having also been nominated the previous year. While most people thought Evans's height must have been a burden, he made the most of his condition. Standing just 3 feet 2 inches tall, he realized that he would often be approached to play parts that had been written especially for him, and stated that if he'd been of normal height, he would have struggled to stand out amongst other actors, and likely would not have seen as much success. Then, in August of 2005, he became the subject of a coincidence that many people find very strange. On the 5th of August of that year, he was undergoing a medical procedure due to his heart condition, and unfortunately passed away in a hospital in San Diego. Strangely, his character on Passions, Timmy, lost his life in the show on the very same day, an event that none of his friends and family could have seen coming. Furthermore, in that episode, Timmy donates his heart to one of the other characters, leading to his passing. The episode was filmed weeks before the incident, and Timmy was set to return as an angel later on, but when news broke that Evans had passed away, that part of the plot fell away, and that same episode was dedicated to his memory. Timmy is still thought of as the show's most popular character, despite it being aired a further 3 years after his passing, and his absence from the show is considered by many to have been one of the reasons for its cancellation in 2008. Many people feel that the TV series MASH had a hand in changing the television industry forever. But not everyone knows that the TV series is based on a movie, which was based on a book written by a surgeon called H. Richard Hornberger, though it was published under his pseudonym Richard Hooker. The book, which is called MASH, a novel about 3 doctors, was a collaboration between Hornberger and author W.G. Hines, and is based on Hornberger's time with the 8055th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, in which he served during the Korean War. Director Robert Altman read the book and 2 years later decided that it would make for a good movie. He changed the name of the unit to the 4077th, and the film did well, resulting in the series, which lasted for 11 seasons. The show was an instant hit and very quickly became a household name. At the end of the last season, more people tuned into the finale than ever before, and it still remains the most watched TV show finale of all time. Quite unbelievably, the show's pilot was written in just 2 days by author and playwright Larry Gelbart. Gelbart had been living in London for some time after growing tired of Hollywood, but when he was asked to write a pilot for the show, he was quick to accept. One complaint that some fans have is the fact that the show makes use of canned laughter, something that Gelbart and the producer, Gene Reynolds, were dead set against, but CBS insisted that it be used, except for scenes that took place in the operating room. As the show continued, the canned laughter became ever quieter, and in the UK it wasn't used at all. The network also insisted that some scenes were cut since they were unpatriotic. In one episode, a group of soldiers attempt to intentionally get ill, and to do this they stand out in the cold for as long as they can. The scene was omitted from the show since it was a tactic that some soldiers actually used during the Korean War. But the show did have some problems. Actor John Rogers, who played the role of Trapper John, started voicing his opinion about the standard contracts that actors received in those days, and when he was ignored, he simply left the show, since he'd never signed a contract. The series also saw a slew of actors who weren't very well known at the time, but who would go on to have very successful acting careers, such as Patrick Swayze, Leslie Nielsen, Ron Howard, Lawrence Fishburne, and John Ritter, to name but a few. When it finally came to an end, the finale, which was entitled Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, was watched by an unbelievable 121 million people, proving that it was one of the most successful TV series ever made. But the show is also the subject of a very strange coincidence that took place in February of 1996. The role of Colonel Henry Blake was played by Roger Bowen, and then in the TV series by McLean Stevenson. On the 15th of February of that year, Stevenson suffered a heart attack that unfortunately ended his life. Just hours later, Bowen suffered the same fate and also passed away. Stevenson passed away in Los Angeles, while Bowen lost his life in Marathon, Florida, while on vacation. To avoid confusion in the media, the Bowen family didn't immediately break the news of his passing, and only did so a week later. Carrie Fisher is best remembered for her role as Princess Leia in the original Star Wars film, but she was familiar with fame in all things Hollywood from the day that she was born, since her mother, Debbie Reynolds, had been in the industry for a long time. Reynolds made her way into the industry after winning a beauty pageant in 1948, where she was noticed by talent scouts from MGM and Warner Brothers. She decided to sign with Warner Brothers, and she would rise to fame after starring in the film Singing in the Rain. She married Eddie Fisher, and they had a daughter, Carrie, in 1956. Carrie soon grew used to the fame and fortune around her, and started showing interest in becoming an actress from an early age, just as her mother had. In 1975, she landed a role in a movie called Shampoo, and when she was cast in the Star Trek movies, she became an icon. Reynolds and Fisher's relationship had some issues at times, but they remained very close, and fans have noticed many similarities in their respective careers. For instance, they both landed their breakout roles when they were 19 years old. Both at times played strong, fearless women, and both accepted voice roles in animated shows such as Family Guy. They both also went on to have troubled marriages, but went on to have children that they loved very much. But there is one coincidence shared between the mother and daughter that's left many fans speechless. On the 23rd of September, 2016, Fisher was returning to Los Angeles from London after the completion of a book tour. But just as the plane was getting ready to descend, she started feeling sick and suffered a heart attack that landed her in the hospital. She'd pass away 4 days later, leaving Reynolds distraught at the loss of her daughter. According to some sources, she was inconsolable and understandably struggled to come to terms with the news. The very next day, Reynolds suffered a stroke and was taken to a medical center in Los Angeles. Here, she stated that she wanted to be with Carrie, just moments before passing away. Many people felt that she passed away from a broken heart, but her son stated that this was not true and that she simply left to be with her daughter. Ice hockey is an intense game that moves very quickly, and the athletes that take part in the sport need to be very fit to keep up with their opponents. While the sport may be very popular in the US, Canada, and Scandinavian countries, it doesn't have such a big following in other countries, though it is played across the world. Because of this, not many people are aware of a coincidence that took place in two different games being played at the same time in December of 2023, involving two brothers, Arbor and Florian Jacki, who were playing in different parts of the US. Arbor started his hockey career in the minor leagues with the Hamilton Huskies, a team that's based in Ontario, Canada. He missed out on the 2017 Ontario Hockey League priority selection draft since he was of a slight build. Because of this, he started thinking of pursuing other avenues, but his parents encouraged him to keep playing. He then started playing as a junior for the St. Catharines Falcons in Ontario, and was invited to the Kitchener Rangers training camp in 2018. He was picked for the team but only played 2 seasons before the COVID-19 pandemic struck, and the 2020 and 2021 season was canceled. He then signed with the Montreal Canadiens as a free agent, and remained with the Rangers until he was traded to the Hamilton Bulldogs. The team made it to the Memorial Cup final, but lost to the St. John Sea Dogs. Arbor was then chosen for the Canadiens and made his debut in October of 2022. He scored his first goal on the 22nd of October that year, and was given the nickname Wi-Fi because his teammates thought his surname looked like the Wi-Fi router password. In February of the next year, he sustained a shoulder injury, and his first professional season came to an end, having scored 5 goals. The following season, he suffered another injury that saw him relegated to the sidelines for 7 games. He was then sent to play with the Laval Rocket team, where he was tasked with working on his defensive play, and he played a large part in helping that team climb the standings that year. He was brought back to the Canadiens in February of the next year, but sustained another injury that required surgery. In July of 2024, he signed a 2-year extension with the Canadiens, worth $2.6 million. His younger brother Florian has had a much shorter career up to this point, but is currently playing for the Laval Rocket team after being drafted by the Canadiens in 2023. In December of 2024, he had his best game so far against the Bridgeport Islanders, scoring 3 goals, his first hat trick, and added 2 assists to that tally. Many fans are excited about his career and are certain that it's only a matter of time before he makes it to the NHL. In the meantime, the two brothers were being discussed in online forums thanks to a strange coincidence that happened while they were playing for their respective teams. At the time, Arbor was playing for the Laval Rockets, while Florian was playing with the Brantford Bulldogs. Arbor scored a goal at 4:11 p.m. that day, much to the delight of the team's fans. But unbeknownst to him, Florian, who was playing against the Barrie Colts, scored after just 12 seconds, also at 4:11 p.m. It was only later that the two brothers found out about this unlucky coincidence, and they were both hailed by news outlets as having made their mother proud. Albert Camus was a French philosopher, political activist, author, and journalist who's best known for winning the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957. At the time, he was the second youngest recipient of the reward at 44 years old. Camus was born in Algeria in 1913, but his family relocated to Belcourt in Algiers when his father lost his life during the Battle of the Marne. Following this, his mother struggled financially but made a living as a cleaner. But he excelled academically and won a high school scholarship. Here, he started playing football or soccer for Americans, but when he contracted tuberculosis, he no longer participated in the sport. This same condition caused him to enter college 2 years later, but eventually started studying at the University of Algiers' School of Philosophy, which he paid for by working several jobs. He then started appreciating the theater, and in 1934 got married to a wealthy woman named Simone High. But he soon learned that she was addicted to illegal substances, and that she'd been unfaithful, so the marriage fell apart. In 1937, he published his first book called The Wrong Side and the Right Side, and also wrote A Happy Death, which he never saw published. He then married a mathematician, and they had a set of twins. But he struggled to remain faithful to his wife, and he's known to have had an affair at one point. His most famous book is called The Stranger, in which a man finds himself embroiled in a murder mystery. He took inspiration from writers like Ernest Hemingway and James Faulkner, but was also inspired by the novel The Postman Always Rings Twice. Camus was also inspired by many other artists and is mentioned in songs by Blur, The Cure, Neil Diamond, Suede, and Iron Maiden, among many others. His book The Stranger has been made into a film twice, but is also seen in other movies from time to time. It can be seen in the hands of characters in Jacob's Ladder, Talladega Nights, An Education, and Jarhead. It's also said that ex-President George Bush read the novel while he was on vacation in 2006. Then in 1942, Camus published The Myth of Sisyphus, in which he philosophizes about the absurd and the mysteries of the human condition, which he compared to Sisyphus, who was forced to push a large boulder uphill for the rest of eternity. In 1946, he traveled to the US for the first time, and while there visited the Central Park Zoo 20 times. He passed away on the 4th of January, 1960, at the age of 46, in a coincidental accident that also claimed the life of his friend, publisher Michael Gallimard. Gallimard was driving a car in which his wife, daughter, and Camus were passengers. They were on their way to Paris after visiting Provence, but Camus had to be persuaded to get in the vehicle, since he was terrified of cars, once stating there's nothing more absurd than to die in a car accident. He had originally planned to travel to Paris by train with his family, but Gallimard convinced him to travel in a car, and he reluctantly agreed. About 65 miles from Paris, Gallimard lost control of the car and collided with a tree, instantly ending Camus' life. Gallimard's wife and daughter were unharmed, but he was taken to the hospital after suffering injuries and passed away 5 days later. Investigators never figured out what caused the accident, since they'd been traveling on a straight road within the speed limit on a day with excellent visibility. Because of this, many people feel that there's more to this incident than meets the eye. It's been speculated that his life was ended by the KGB after the poet Giovanni Catelli found an excerpt in a diary of a Czech poet, which read, quote, "I heard something very strange from the mouth of a man who knew lots of things and had very informed sources." According to him, the accident that had cost Albert Camus his life in 1960 was organized by Soviet spies. They damaged a tire on the car using a sophisticated piece of equipment that cut or made a hole in the wheel at speed. These claims have been trashed by scholars who have studied Camus' life, though no proof was ever found that this wasn't the case. His passing has since been labeled as absurd by modern scholars, in reference to his aversion to cars, and the fact that he thought losing a life in one would be absurd. C.S. Lewis is one of the most famous authors of all time. One of his many famous books, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is the first in his Chronicles of Narnia series, is considered to be one of the top 100 English-language novels of the modern era. Lewis attended Oxford University, but his studies were interrupted by the outbreak of World War I. When his military service came to an end, he returned to Oxford, where he became an English literature tutor at Magdalen College. He'd always had a love for fantasy novels and was inspired by authors such as George MacDonald. As a child, he imagined a world called Boxen, where people could converse with animals, and it comes as no surprise that he was a good friend of J.R.R. Tolkien's. They were both members of a literary group called the Inklings, which held meetings at Oxford. He married Joy Davidman Gresham in 1956, and their relationship was the inspiration for the Sir Richard Attenborough film called Shadowlands. But not many people know that he shares a coincidence with another famous author, Aldous Huxley. Huxley had a rough time as a teenager since his mother passed away, and shortly after he started suffering from keratitis, which is inflammation of the corneas. He spent most of his life struggling with his vision, but managed to improve his condition by exercising his eyes and spending time in the sun, though medical professionals have since expressed their doubts about this type of treatment. He's best remembered for his novel Brave New World, in which he describes Earth in a dystopian future. But he wrote many other novels, such as The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell, and even contributed to Vanity Fair, House and Garden, and Vogue magazines. In the 1930s, he spent some time in California, and over the next 2 decades worked as a screenwriter. He had a hand in films like Pride and Prejudice and Madame Curie. He was a known pacifist, a trait that excluded him from becoming an American citizen. While applying for citizenship, he was asked whether he would defend the U.S. if war were to break out, but he refused to answer and he withdrew his application. He was also very outspoken about the overpopulation of our planet, and stated that if the population was to increase at the current rate, food reserves would become depleted, and that a powerful central government would be formed, leading to an unrest among the public. In 1960, he was diagnosed with cancer of the larynx, and he would lose his fight with the disease 3 years later. That same year, C.S. Lewis was admitted to a hospital after suffering a heart attack. In November of that year, he was diagnosed with kidney failure, and on the 22nd of November, 1963, he passed away at the age of 64. If that date sounds familiar, it's because it's the same day on which then President of the U.S., John F. Kennedy, was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. The news of the president's passing understandably took the nation by storm, especially in the half an hour after the incident took place, as people waited with bated breath to hear whether or not he survived. When the news broke that he had lost his life, the nation went into mourning, and the passing of 2 of the most famous writers of the 20th century went by almost unnoticed in the years that followed. The anniversaries of both of their deaths would remain overshadowed by tributes to Kennedy and the impact that he had on the country. There are many Hollywood films where eerie and disturbing coincidences during production have left people believing the movie is cursed. Most of the time, these movies are already produced and in cinemas before word of a supposed curse becomes public. Less common are creepy coincidences leading to rumors of a curse before a single scene of the movie has been recorded. A Confederacy of Dunces is a movie that has never been made. A book of the same name was first published in 1981, written by John Kennedy Toole over a decade earlier, and it's a satirical story about an overweight, misanthropic scholar named Ignatius J. Riley, set in New Orleans. Toole's struggles to get the novel published eventually claimed his life, and it was the work of his mother that got the novel published after he'd passed away. A Confederacy of Dunces was a hit, and Toole became one of only 3 writers to win a Pulitzer Prize after they had already passed away. Almost immediately, people began to work on bringing Ignatius's story to the cinema. But Toole's struggles to get the book published seemed to continue into the movie's production. The first name to become attached to the movie was actor and director Harold Ramis in 1982. A script was written, and plans were made for John Belushi to star as Ignatius. Belushi and Ramis had worked together on Animal House, and the actor seemed to be the perfect person for the role. Unfortunately, Belushi had some difficulties in his private life, and on March 5th of 1982, he passed away. According to some sources, this was the day before he was due to officially sign on to the project. After Belushi's passing, Ramis briefly stepped away from the project. The rights to create the movie adaptation were passed around, and many actors and comedians were approached for the role. Most turned it down, and it seemed like the movie would never be made. In the 1990s, it was Scott Kramer and Scott Rudin who were the main force behind producing the movie. They brought on Stephen Fry to write the script. Saturday Night Live star Chris Farley seemed to be in line to star as Ignatius, and it was then that a coincidental tragedy struck. On December 18, 1997, Farley passed away. The cause of his passing was the exact same as Belushi's, and both actors were the same age when they lost their lives. For many, this eerie coincidence was enough to convince them that the movie was cursed. This was despite the fact that Farley himself was never officially tied to the film. Since 1997, there have been more attempts to bring A Confederacy of Dunces to cinemas. The closest it ever came was a script reading where Will Ferrell was in line to play the lead role. But over the decades, the rights to produce and distribute the film have been passed around so many times that there were now issues over who actually owns the rights. It's a myth that lightning doesn't strike the same place twice, but that doesn't mean it's very common for a lightning strike survivor to be struck a second time. Melvin Roberts has allegedly been struck 11 times. According to statistics, there's roughly a 1 in 9 million chance of being struck by lightning twice. The odds of having Melvin Roberts' luck are incalculable. The man from South Carolina first made news headlines around the world in 2011 when he was struck for the 6th time. The incident happened during a thunderstorm in June. Melvin had gone outside to try to cover up his lawnmower and protect it from the rain. He was found by neighbors lying in the yard, unconscious but alive. The 58-year-old was rushed to the hospital where doctors examined him. Wounds to his ankles and feet lined up with what would have been expected from a lightning strike. He had multiple exit wounds, which is typical for this kind of incident. Thankfully, the damage didn't appear to be too severe, but it was just the latest in a long line of incidents that Melvin had gone through. There's no obvious explanation for why Melvin would be hit by this weather phenomenon more than any other ordinary individual. Some people are more vulnerable to becoming a victim, though. For instance, those who work outdoors are more likely to get caught in a thunderstorm than people who don't. But there's nothing in Melvin's history that would put him in the line of fire more than anybody else. Melvin previously worked with heavy machinery and had once been struck while riding a bulldozer. But after multiple incidents, he had to give up the job due to his disabilities. Melvin describes lightning strikes as like being cooked from the inside. In the moment of the strike, there's no pain. That comes later. Melvin has scars on his head and leg from previous incidents. But the more significant damage isn't as obvious. Melvin suffers from memory and speech problems, as well as headaches and nerve damage on his hands and left leg. All that meant that he had to quit his job, but the lightning strikes continued. Another possible reason why Melvin is more vulnerable than most is his hearing loss. Melvin is less able to hear thunder than others, but that wouldn't explain why he was struck on an otherwise clear day. In 2011, Melvin told the media about an incident where he was struck by lightning while tending to his chickens. Before that, there hadn't even been a cloud in the sky, and no warning that anything was about to happen. Melvin is a celebrity in the local medical community, but some people have doubted Melvin's story. The Guinness Book of World Records doesn't feature him. They claim there isn't enough evidence to support Melvin's claims. But he has a stack of medical files related to the various wounds he suffered from the multiple strikes. He also keeps a box of the watches he was wearing when strikes occurred. Each watch is stopped at the time when the disaster happened. There are many different reasons why a particular battle, or even war, may swing one way or another. But there are a few incidents throughout history where uncontrollable factors and chance play an important role in deciding the victor. The Spanish Armada was one such incident. The attack of 1588 was years in the making. For years, Spain and England had been at war, although one was never officially declared between the two countries. There'd been no major confrontations between the two countries, but England had been causing problems for the Spanish king. English privateers had attacked Spanish ships coming from the New World loaded with treasure. England had also been supporting rebels in the Netherlands, which was controlled by Spain at the time. Spain was ruled by Catholic Philip I, while England was under the control of Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, who shared sympathies with Protestant Dutch rebels. Philip was familiar with England. He'd previously been married to Elizabeth's older half-sister, Queen Mary I. He knew that the country's only real defense was its position as an island, and if he could get troops in England itself, the battle would almost be won. At this time, England wasn't known for its navy prowess, as would come to be the case in the future, and the Spanish believed that an invasion over the English Channel was possible. A few things caused problems for Philip before the Armada ever left Spain. The first was that Francis Drake, one of the privateers who'd already caused so much damage to Spain's treasure ships, had launched a surprise raid on the port of Cadiz. This destroyed several ships and their supplies, delaying the invasion by months. The second issue was an unfortunate coincidence. Philip had appointed the Admiral Santa Cruz to lead the Armada, but he passed away shortly before the planned attack. Philip replaced him with the Duke of Medina Sidonia, who had little naval experience. Even this may not have had too much of an impact were it not for bad luck that would happen later in the invasion. The original plan had been for the fleet to sail to Calais, where they would pick up the Duke of Parma and his army. These were experienced soldiers who'd been fighting in the Netherlands. The Spanish fleet was less maneuverable than the English and not prepared for the difficult waters of the Channel, but they still made it to Calais undamaged. It was then that things turned in the English's favor. The Duke of Parma would not be coming. His men had been stopped in a blockade in the Netherlands. On top of that, the wind had changed, allowing the English to send fire ships into the Spanish ranks. The formation that had protected the fleet through the Channel was abandoned. The English were able to get closer and actually damage the Spanish vessels in the following battle. Only a few ships were actually sunk in the battle, though. Most were able to escape. Medina Sidonia made the decision to abandon the plan and return to Spain. That way, a second attempt could be made when Parma was available. But unseasonable storms would prevent the ships from going back the way they had come. The fleet was blown north, and they were forced to round Scotland and Ireland before reaching the Iberian Peninsula. Along the way, the fleet was battered by storms. Half the Armada was destroyed, and thousands of men lost their lives. The Anglo-Spanish War would continue, but after the disaster of the First Armada, a second wouldn't come soon. 16 years later, a second Spanish Armada was launched, and this one wouldn't get out of Spanish waters before more storms shattered the fleet and forced the Spanish to abandon the plan. The story of Jantia van Sluys is one of the lesser-known stories of a small coincidence changing the face of a battle. Sluys is a city in the Netherlands, located in the southwestern province of Zeeland. It became an important port city due to the silting up of the Zwin River. As more and more silt entered the river, the important city of Bruges lost access to the sea, and Sluys became the best option for people trading in that part of the country. During the 80 Years' War, as the Netherlands fought for independence from Spain, Sluys was once again an important city. The area was split between people loyal to Spain and those that supported the Dutch. Sluys's importance as a trade city was added to by the strategic positioning the fortified town offered both sides. In the early stages of the war, the city was in Spanish hands, but that came to an end during the siege of Sluys in 1604. For roughly 3 months, joint Dutch and English forces blockaded the city, stopping any food from getting in and fighting off those who came to relieve the town. Eventually, in August of that year, the garrison within the town was forced to surrender. Sluys fell into Dutch hands, and it would stay that way until the end of the war. The Spanish didn't simply give up on Sluys, though. Years later, they would return with a plan to recapture the city. The details of the 1606 attack of Sluys are less well documented than the earlier siege. Many parts of the story are only remembered as legends, but those stories may still have a hint of truth within them. The Spanish planned for the attack to coincide with celebrations within the city. They figured that the troops inside would be less prepared for a battle at this point. The plan focused on the East Gate, but relied on a distraction on the south side of the city that would draw troops away from the main attacking force. To keep the second force a secret, the two groups couldn't communicate with one another. Instead, they planned for the distraction to begin with the signal of a bell that would be sounded within the city. Unfortunately, the plan to attack after a holiday celebration backfired on the Spanish. According to legend, the bell ringer was a man named Jantia, who'd spent the night before drinking at the celebrations. He delegated the bell ringing to his son and another relative who was not well practiced in the mechanism. The young men made a mistake, and the bell didn't sound correctly. Outside the city walls, the Spanish attackers thought that the faulty bell meant that their plan had been revealed to the defenders. The attack was mostly abandoned, although some still tried to force an entrance into the city during the night. They were swiftly defeated, and the Sluys remained in Dutch hands. Today, Jantia van Sluys is remembered as a hero of the city. If the legend is to be believed, his decision on the night of the attack kept the Spanish force out of the city and may have had a larger impact on the war as a whole. In the first 57 years of Glacier National Park's existence, there'd been no fatal bear attacks, but that would come to an end on one tragic night in August of 1967. In the early morning hours of August 13th, two young women in completely separate parts of the park were attacked by grizzly bears. Sadly, both would lose their lives in the attacks. In many ways, the situation at Glacier National Park was a disaster waiting to happen. Today, people who visit national parks where bears live are given many instructions on how to keep safe around America's largest predators. There are strict rules surrounding where food can be stored and what happens to trash once campers have finished with their trip. But in the 1960s, none of those rules were in place. At both Glacier and Yellowstone National Park, which also is home to many grizzly bears, trash was dumped out in the open. It was an easy place for bears to come and get food, and one dump in Yellowstone even became a tourist attraction. In Glacier, guests would feed bears table scraps. The problem was known to park staff, but keeping people and bears separate wasn't a priority. Bears were no longer scared of humans. In fact, they'd come to associate humans with food. It was only a matter of time before that association cost someone their life. The first victim was a woman named Julie Hegelson. She was 19 years old and had come to Glacier from Minnesota. She intended to spend the summer working at East Glacier Lodge and had been enjoying her time at the park so far. On the night of August 12th, she went on a backpacking trip with a friend, Roy Ducat. The trip took her through the Highline Trail to Granite Park Chalet. It was here where just days earlier, park staff had witnessed guests feeding scraps to bears. Today, if bears are spotted in a particular area, the trails are closed off to visitors until the animals have moved on. That rule was only introduced after the 1967 tragedy. Julie and Roy set up in sleeping bags around a campfire. It was just after midnight when they were woken from their sleep by a bear wandering through their camp. They tried to stay as still as possible, but the bear wasn't fooled. It first attacked Roy, biting into his arm before attacking Julie. She was dragged out of her sleeping bag and pulled away. Other campers were woken, and Roy received medical help. There was some delay before teams went in search of Julie, as park staff didn't want to risk any more lives. Julie was found face down and badly wounded but still alive. She was rushed to the chalet but passed away due to wounds just after 4 a.m. Meanwhile, an eerily similar scene played out at Trout Lake. Michelle Coons was another 19-year-old woman who'd come up from California to work at the park for the summer. She'd gone on a hiking trip with a small group of friends. On the night of August 12th, their camp was disturbed by a bear, but the group managed to get away. After the bear wandered off, they returned and decided to stay for the night. At 4:30 a.m., the bear came back. Michelle's friends jumped into trees to try to get away from the bear, but she struggled with the zipper on her sleeping bag. The bear attacked her before she could get away, dragging her into the forest. Michelle also wouldn't survive the attack. Two separate bears were responsible for the attack, and it seems to be nothing more than a coincidence that the bears chose this particular night and such similar victims. It was surprising that it had happened twice in one night, but the park staff weren't surprised that such an attack had happened. In the aftermath of the Night of the Grizzlies, new measures were put into place to protect park visitors from bears and to stop the wild animals from feeding on human trash. History is filled with moments where if things hadn't coincidentally happened at just the right time, the course of the future would be very different. In the 6th century AD, a plague that swept through the Mediterranean region was one such instance. In 527 AD, Emperor Justinian had risen to power in Constantinople. There'd been some problems at the start of his reign, including a war with the Sassanid Empire that left the Eastern Roman Empire paying a large sum of money to the Sassanids every year. But by the mid-530s, Justinian's grand plan of conquering all that had once been the Roman Empire was well underway. Largely due to the successes of General Belisarius, much of North Africa was conquered, and the focus turned to reclaiming the Italian peninsula from the Goths. The first phase of the war in Italy wasn't easy, and thousands of soldiers were sent from eastern Rome to aid the fighting, but it was a cost that the empire was well equipped to pay. In 540, Belisarius recaptured the city of Rome itself, and was actually offered the title of king by the Goths. He handed Rome to the emperor, and Justinian came the closest anybody for centuries had to holding all of Rome's old territory. But two things would undo all the work that had been done in the West. One of these was a strategic move that was already underway when Belisarius was in Rome. The other was something more coincidental that could have changed history forever. When the Romans had made peace with Persia, it was described as an eternal peace. But with Rome's army in Italy, Persian Emperor Khusru I decided it was time to invade Roman territory in 540 AD. He had some early successes, and Belisarius was quickly recalled from Rome. But as the two armies met, the second factor appeared. In 541, reports of a plague began to emerge in a port city in Egypt. This quickly spread to Alexandria, and from there to the rest of the Mediterranean. Today, scientists believe it was the first major outbreak of the bubonic plague, the same disease that would take the lives of millions in Europe centuries later. Historians are still debating just how significant the Justinian plague actually was. Reports at the time claimed that thousands of people were losing their lives every day in Constantinople, and mass graves had to be dug. But historians believe that may have been exaggerated, and the impact wasn't as significant. What we do know is that the plague infected soldiers, and the war with the Sassanid Empire had to be postponed until after the outbreak. By that point, Rome couldn't rely on the manpower that it once had, and its later wars were fought by large groups of barbarian mercenaries, as well as Roman soldiers. The plague also struck the Sassanid Empire, which meant they couldn't take advantage of the weakened Byzantines. If the plague hadn't occurred at this specific point in time, the war in the East would have gone ahead and could have changed the face of the Eastern Roman Empire. At the turn of the 20th century, huge advancements were made in the study of the atom. It's not surprising that the person who first proved that there were particles smaller than the atom mentored others who would refine the models he put forward. What was more surprising was that his own son would turn his discovery on its head. In 1897, physicist Joseph John Thomson discovered the electron. This was the first subatomic particle ever discovered, and the first time anybody had ever proven that something smaller than an atom existed. Thomson used cathode ray tubes to make his discovery. These featured a cathode and an anode at one end, which produced something called a cathode ray, which would then be detected at the other end of the tube. At the time, scientists weren't sure what exactly the cathode ray actually was. All air was removed from the tube, but some people believed there was something left behind, which transported energy from one end of the tube to the other. Others thought the cathode ray itself was made up of particles. By using magnets on either side of the tube, J.J. Thomson proved that the cathode ray was made up of negatively charged particles. He could also calculate the exact mass of the particle, determining that it was more than 1,000 times lighter than the lightest atom. In 1906, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics for his discovery. With this discovery, a new field of science opened up. This new particle needed to be investigated and fully understood. It clearly played an important role in electricity, which was becoming more and more important in day-to-day life. As well as understanding the electron itself, scientists needed to understand the makeup of the atom. It wasn't just one particle, but something more complicated. Decades later, Thomson's son, George Thomson, was one of the people expanding on his father's work. But what George Thomson discovered changed the way scientists looked at the particles his father discovered forever. George's experiments used thin films of metal with crystal-like structures. A stream of electrons were fired at the metals. It was expected that these particles would all bounce off the metals in the same direction. Instead, the electrons behaved like a wave, diffracting and resulting in different patterns. Another scientist, Clinton Davison, made the same discovery at the same time. The subatomic particle George's father had discovered was not a particle at all. It appeared to be a wave. The younger Thomson and Davison won the Nobel Prize for their discovery in 1937, apparently for disproving what the senior Thomson had been awarded the prize for 31 years earlier. In reality, the nature of the electron is more complicated than either Thomson could ever imagine. Today, some people like to think of things like electrons behaving like particles in some instances, and waves in others. But in reality, electrons behave like waves and particles at the same time. This is true of many subatomic particles, and some scientists have suggested using the phrase wavicle to describe these. This area of science is still being investigated, but it seems that at such a small scale, the difference between a wave and a particle breaks down into something new. On the night of October 8th, 1871, a devastating fire ripped through communities, burning everything in its wake. It would take weeks for the full extent of the damage to be understood, but thousands of people lost their lives, and many more were made homeless. But due to a sad coincidence, most people would never hear about this tragedy. The Peshtigo fire occurred on the same night as the famous Great Chicago Fire. The town of Peshtigo itself wasn't too far from Chicago, and was one of the largest suppliers of timber to the large city. But the two fires occurring on the same night were unrelated. While the eyes of the nation were on Chicago, it took attention and resources away from the more devastating fire further north. Peshtigo was a small town in eastern Wisconsin, named after a river of the same name. It was one of many towns in the area set up to take advantage of the forests that covered the landscape. Settlers from all over Europe had made the region their home and had slowly been clearing away the forest for use in the timber trade. Peshtigo was home to the largest woodware factory in the country, attracting more workers. The summer of 1871 had been very dry, and in October the drought was continuing. Small fires weren't uncommon. There was plenty of tinder lying around as proper forest fire safety techniques weren't being used. Anything from a campfire to controlled burning for the railway could spark a blaze that quickly grew larger than expected. The people of Peshtigo were used to this though, and the fires were normally swiftly put out. So when they noticed ash and smoke in the air on the night of October 8th, they weren't immediately alarmed. For many, by the time they realized how serious the fire was, it was too late. Stories told by survivors of the fire are harrowing. The air itself seemed to ignite, and people couldn't keep their eyes open as they tried to make their way to safety. The river provided a refuge, but it was also another danger. This was early October and the water was cold. Many who survived the blaze would pass away due to hypothermia. The entire town of Peshtigo was destroyed, and roughly half the people who lived there lost their lives. At first, they hoped they could stay in other towns in the area while Peshtigo was being rebuilt, but that wouldn't be possible. Other communities across the peninsula had also been destroyed. While most didn't lose quite as many people as Peshtigo, the buildings themselves were left in ruins. The exact number of people who lost their lives in the Peshtigo fire is still unknown to this day. Town records were burned. Many of the people caught in the blaze would have only recently moved to the area for work. In some cases, entire families were lost, and there was nobody left to look for them. It's believed between 1,500 and 2,500 people lost their lives that night, many more than in the more famous Great Chicago Fire. When a telegram was sent to the governor of Wisconsin in Madison, he wasn't home. He'd already left to help survivors in the Chicago Fire. The governor's wife, Frances Bull Fairchild, responded to the telegram and redirected aid that had been set for Chicago to Peshtigo. The town and others in the region would slowly rebuild. The survivors would never forget the harrowing event, but due to the other fire that took place that night, many elsewhere in the country would. On March 30th, 1981, John Hinckley Jr. opened fire at then-President Ronald Reagan. Thanks to the quick action of Reagan's Secret Service detail, he survived the attack. But as the primary agent involved in the incident later said, Reagan was the agent of his own destiny. 22 years before that fateful day in Washington, the movie Code of the Secret Service was released in cinemas. The film tells the story of a Secret Service agent, Brass Bancroft, trying to take down a counterfeiting ring in Mexico. The main character was portrayed by a young Ronald Reagan. The film wasn't very well received, and even Reagan said that it was his worst film. But one of the people who did enjoy the movie was Jerry Parr. Parr was just 9 years old at the time, and he watched the action film in the cinema with his father. It would later inspire him to become a Secret Service agent himself. Parr tried his hand at a few different careers before graduating from university in 1962. He interviewed for a role at the CIA and another at the Secret Service. Parr was interested in doing something that made a difference, and when the Secret Service recruiter told him that there was a possibility he would have to put his life on the line, he decided that was the job he wanted. He was also partially swayed by the performance he'd seen years earlier in Code of the Secret Service. Parr started working as a security detail for some low-risk individuals, but would gradually work his way up through the organization. He worked in protection more often than most agents, rather than in the field. The agency liked the way that Parr worked. In just a few years, he was working protection for people like the British Prime Minister, Prince Hussein of Jordan, and various vice presidents. In 1979, he was promoted to special agent in charge of the Presidential Protection Division. He continued his role as Reagan took office and was on duty on March 30th, 1981. Reagan had been on a routine visit to the Washington Hilton Hotel to give a speech to labor union leaders. It was as he was exiting the hotel at the end of the meeting that Hinckley called his name. The president turned around and shots rang out. Parr pushed him into the presidential limousine and directed the driver to take him back to the White House. Within seconds, they were on their way. At first, it seemed as if Reagan had gotten away unhurt, but then Parr noticed that the president had gone pale. Reagan believed he'd broken a rib when he was thrown into the car, but Parr knew that it was something more serious. He redirected the car to George Washington University Hospital. There, doctors discovered that he'd been struck by a bullet after it ricocheted off the car. Nancy Reagan would later say that if it wasn't for Parr, her husband likely wouldn't have survived. Reagan pulled through and was back at work within a couple of weeks. 3 others were wounded in the attack, including Press Secretary James Brady, who was left with brain damage. Hinckley was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was confined to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Parr continued his service but later retired to serve as a pastor. Movies typically take years to produce, so when one is released around the same time that something similar happens in real life, it's normally nothing more than a strange coincidence. But some coincidences are stranger than most. This was the case with the 1986 film Space Camp. The film was supposed to be an action-adventure film set in space. The plot surrounds a group of teenagers attending space camp in Alabama, where they're supposed to learn about the training astronauts go through and get a chance to sit on the space shuttle. One of the children befriends a robot who takes things too literally. When the robot overhears the character say that he wishes he was in space, the robot decides to make that wish a reality. The group is on the shuttle during a routine engine test, but the robot causes one of the boosters to ignite. Engineers have no choice but to send the shuttle into space with the teenagers and their teacher, a female NASA-trained astronaut. The movie was directed by Harry Weiner, who got to see the final cut of his movie for the first time on January 28, 1986. This was just hours after the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. The Challenger disaster is probably the most famous disaster in NASA's history. By the mid-1980s, space shuttle launches were no longer the spectacle they'd previously been. A plan was launched to regain the excitement of the 60s and 70s. NASA would launch the first civilian into space. Teacher Krista McAuliffe was elected for the role. NASA hoped to have a teacher on the shuttle, and it would attract the attention of children, and the launch was broadcast live in schools around the country. On the morning of the launch, a cold snap in Florida had caused the rubber O-rings on the right side rocket booster to weaken. When the rocket was launched, the rings failed and caused a fire. That fire then led to a series of failures which ultimately caused the shuttle to erupt in mid-air. All on board were lost. When Harry Weiner watched his movie just hours later, the coincidental similarities were obvious to see. Not only did the movie feature a near-shuttle disaster, but it was caused by a right-side rocket booster malfunction. The movie also featured a female instructor, adding another similarity. The The fact that the Teacher in Space project and Space Camp were created at roughly the same time wasn't a coincidence, though. Both were part of NASA's strategy to appeal to children. NASA had worked with the writers of the movie to make it as realistic as possible, in the hopes that it would encourage children to be interested in science and space. Of course, in the movie, the near disaster was caused by something more fantastical than real life, showing that the writers didn't believe something like the Challenger disaster would actually happen. Even though some believed that the movie was trying to take advantage of the tragedy, Space Camp was released as planned that summer. Coincidentally, the release date was June 6th, the same day that the Rogers Commission delivered its report on the disaster to President Reagan. The movie received mixed reviews when it was released, and it didn't do well at the box office. It may not have been a success, but it did accomplish its goal of encouraging some children to turn to a career in science. Iceland is known for its volcanic activity. In 2010, the eruption of one of its younger volcanoes caused international disruption. But it wasn't another volcano on the island that the people were worried about. In March of 2010, the volcano Eyjafjallajökull started to erupt. Also known as E15, the volcano is located on the island's southern edge. Like the other volcanoes in Iceland, the magma from this volcano ultimately comes from pulling apart of the sea floor along the mid-Atlantic ridge. But even though this tectonic divergence is where all the volcanoes started life, it doesn't mean that they're all connected. Each volcano has its own magma chamber and its own distinct entity. When E15 erupted in 2010, there was no geological reason to believe that this would set off another volcano in Iceland or anywhere else in the world. Sometimes pressure being released on one magma chamber can increase pressure on another, but this wasn't too much of a worry for volcanologists. But even while the E15 was still erupting and causing air traffic issues across Europe, some news outlets were already looking at another volcano. E15 has only erupted 4 times in recorded history, with 2010 being the most recent of these. In each of the 3 previous eruptions, another volcano soon became active. Katla is one of E15's nearest active neighbors. It's located slightly north of E15 and is roughly the same age. The first recorded eruption of E15 took place in roughly 920 AD. It was what's described as a radial fissure eruption, which scientists say would have taken weeks or months to form. This wasn't long after Iceland was first discovered, and during the initial settlement period, some records of this time aren't complete. But looking at the historical record, scientists have been able to determine that Katla erupted shortly after this. Katla's eruption was more significant than E15's, and ranked 1 place higher on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. The next eruption of E15 took place around 1612, and was much smaller than the eruption that E15 is known for today. It only lasted a few days, and was confined to the summit of the mountain. In October of the same year, Katla would erupt again. Again, it came with much more force, and it caused a glacial flooding event. A few hundred years would pass before E15 erupted again. The eruption of 1821 was very different to either of those that had happened before. It lasted roughly 15 months, but wasn't constantly billowing out plumes of smoke during that time. There were 2 brief periods of ash production, which spread debris across the south of the island, but the damage was limited to just Iceland itself. While there was still steam seen coming from E15, activity began at Katla. In 1823, eruption of Katla ranked lower on the VEI than others, but it still caused glacial flooding and produced ash. The next E15 eruption would be 2010. As each of the volcano's other eruptions have been followed by activity from Katla, there was a worry that Katla would soon erupt too. Scientists have been closely monitoring the larger volcano for over a decade, waiting for activity to begin. But it wouldn't happen. In 2011, there was some earthquake swarms around the mountain, but some scientists speculate that a very small subglacial eruption took place. But other than this, there is no sign of anything like what had happened before. Scientists believe that the 3 other dual eruptions had only been a coincidence. There's nothing geological to connect the 2 volcanoes, and it's unlikely something as small as the 1612 eruption could have shaken Katla so much that it too erupted. Passions was a strange supernatural soap opera that aired between 1999 and 2007. But one of the most eerie details about the show was a coincidence that couldn't be scripted. Not long after the show began, the character of Timmy Lennox was introduced. Timmy was played by Josh Ryan Evans, an actor from California. Josh was born with the form of dwarfism, and this was caused by cartilage not being able to form properly. As is the case with many forms of dwarfism, the condition can come with other medical problems. For Josh, this included problems with his heart. As a child, he underwent many medical procedures, which left him housebound for long periods of time. It was during this time that he developed his passion for acting. Josh entered show business at the age of 12. His medical condition meant he could play characters much younger than he was. When he was in his late teens, he portrayed an 8-year-old version of the Grinch in the 2000 Christmas movie, which is the role he's best remembered for today. In Passions, he played Timmy, a doll that had been brought to life by a witch to assist in her evil schemes. Josh received multiple awards for his portrayal, including the Young Star Awards for Best Young Actor in a Daytime TV Series. Over the course of 2 years, the character of Timmy would develop. At the start of 2002, the character's wish of becoming a real boy instead of a doll was fulfilled. At the same time, the medical conditions that Josh had been dealing with since his childhood were becoming a more serious problem again. Josh would have to take a break from acting to undergo medical treatment, which meant his character wouldn't appear. By this point, Timmy was such an important part of the show that his absence would be obviously noticed if it went unexplained. The writers came up with a plan to give Josh the time he needed to look after his health. The character of Timmy would pass away after an attack. He'd then be brought back to life when Josh was fit enough to return to the role. But sadly, that would never happen. On August 5th of 2002, the episode where Timmy Lennox passed away was aired. On the same day, Josh Ryan Evans also passed. Josh was undergoing surgery to correct a heart problem at a hospital in San Diego, but complications would ultimately claim his life. It's not unusual for soap characters to be written off and pass away off-screen when their actor loses their own life. But what makes the case of Josh and Timmy so eerie is not only that the character passed on air, but that the scene was filmed a whole month in advance. Even though the showrunners knew it was possible that the actor would be undergoing surgery around the time the scene aired, there was no way of knowing for certain. They definitely could not have known that the surgery would take place on the very day the episode aired, and there was no way the coincidence could have been planned. Even stranger, this wasn't the last time something like this would happen on the show. 2 years later, actor David Bailey passed away on Thanksgiving of 2004. That same day, the character he portrayed, Alistair Crane, was attacked by multiple assailants. One of these would briefly claim his life before he was brought back by the same witch who created Timmy. This time, the character would go on, being recast to be portrayed by another actor. Most of the inventions we take for granted today were only created due to chance, coincidence, and luck. It sometimes takes the right person to be in the right place at the right time for something to be created. That was the case with the microwave oven. Most homes in the United States have microwaves today, and around the world they're a common feature in kitchens, but it was only through chance that they were invented. Percy Spencer was a self-taught engineer working at the manufacturing company Raytheon during the Second World War. Spencer had grown up in Maine in a house without electricity, but that didn't stop his natural curiosity. He liked to solve problems and got a job installing electricity in a mill at the age of 14. After the sinking of the Titanic, he joined the Navy. While he was on watch, he would go through textbooks, teaching himself more about engineering. By the 1940s, he knew enough to land a job in the industry. Spencer's problem-solving nature led to many inventions, and he created multiple patents in his lifetime. But the one that he would be most well known for was created by accident. During the war, Spencer and Raytheon were working with radar technology. It was while working on radar magnetrons that the accidental invention of the microwave began. These generate vibrating microwaves using electrons and a magnetic field. When used for radars, the waves reflect off of objects and are detected when they return to the source. As Spencer experimented with the technology, the waves were hitting him, though he didn't worry much about any possible danger from the radiation. The story in the microwave's discovery was passed from Spencer to his grandson, who also went into engineering. According to Spencer, it was getting towards his lunch break when he put his hand in his pocket. He liked to take nut clusters to work with him so that he could share the food with any squirrels he might see on his break. but today the cluster had partially melted in his pocket. Often, popular versions of the story claim it was a chocolate bar in Spencer's pocket. The difference is important, as the nut cluster had a higher melting point. This wouldn't have melted from just being in Spencer's pocket all morning. The inventor knew that the microwaves were to blame and experimented with different kinds of food. He tested with corn kernels, which were shared with other scientists after the microwaves popped them. Spencer also used the device to heat up an egg. At the time of the invention, it wasn't clear if there were any negative side effects of the microwave radiation, but Raytheon knew that there was a great deal of potential for this technology, and quickly patented the first device that used microwaves to cook food. On March 5, 1953, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin passed away after suffering a stroke a few days earlier. The event came less than 2 weeks after an eerie prediction made by one of the most famous preachers in the US. Fulton John Sheen had been referred to as the first televangelist. He pioneered the use of radio and television to preach and won multiple awards, including an Emmy for Most Outstanding Television Personality. He would also appear on the cover of Time magazine. His career started like any other Catholic priest when he was ordained in Illinois in 1919. He taught theology at various universities in Europe and the US, and was a popular instructor. Sheen started writing books, and in 1930, he began a weekly radio program. As television became more popular in the United States, Sheen transitioned to this new format. In 1952, the TV show Life is Worth Living began. Sheen would sit in a set designed to look like a study, and give talks on the moral issues of the day. The show was extremely popular, and it's believed to be one of the most watched religious programs in TV history. Unsurprisingly, given the time period, communism was a frequent subject. In both his radio show and later the TV show, Sheen made many statements against the Soviet regime and the actions of the USSR leader Joseph Stalin. In February of 1937, newspapers reported on a prediction that Sheen made, which had just come true. A few months earlier, Sheen had stated that certain political figures in the Soviet Union would lose their lives if Stalin remained in power for another 5 years. He specified Karl Radek, an important revolutionary figure and writer. Sure enough, Radek was one of the people targeted in the trial of the 17, which took place in January of 1937. It seemed like an ominous prediction, but this was more than just a coincidence. The Moscow trials were well underway at this point, and Sheen would have been able to see the pattern that was emerging. More creepy was the prediction he would make over a decade later. In late February 1953, Sheen again spoke about communism on Life is Worth Living. He gave a reading of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, focusing on the funeral scene. In this version, though, he replaced the names of the main characters with prominent Soviet political figures. Caesar was replaced by Stalin. At the end of the speech, Sheen stated that Stalin must one day meet his judgment. This was broadcast live on February 21st. Just a week later, he suffered a stroke and passed away on March 5th. The coincidence was so strange that newspapers asked Sheen if he had any insider knowledge from the USSR, but Sheen simply stated that he knew Stalin was mortal and had no idea that the day he predicted would come so quickly after he made the statement. The First Crusade had a huge impact on Europe and Asia Minor, and changed the way various people groups interacted with one another for centuries to come. The crusade would ultimately end in a success for the Latin Crusaders, but it may not have been the case were it not for the unintended consequences of an earlier event. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for a crusade in the Holy Land, recapturing the Levant from the Seljuk Turks, who had taken control about 20 years earlier. The speech came in response to requests from the Eastern Roman Emperor for help. The emperor was hoping for some contingents of trained knights who would help bring the area back under Byzantine rule, but this wasn't what he received. Many noblemen answered the Pope's call. These weren't kings or heirs to the thrones of their respective lands, but dukes and counts with little land of their own. For them, the crusade was about securing glory for themselves, as well as taking control of the Levant. But they weren't the only people who liked the idea of the crusade. A preacher named Peter the Hermit was one of many commoners who also wanted to go on crusade. Peter had previously tried to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but it had been stopped by the Seljuk Turks. This, combined with the Pope's words, inspired Peter to lead his own crusades. He preached across Western Europe and gathered together a group of his own followers who would march with him in what is today known as the People's Crusade. The People's Crusade was actually made up of many small groups of travelers, often with their own leaders who came together to form the larger mass. There were some trained fighters in the groups, and minor nobles led some of their own small bands, but most of the People's Crusade was made up of peasants, including women, children, and the elderly. They were unprepared for the journey to Constantinople, and definitely weren't ready for the fighting that would take place once they reached Asia Minor. Marching across Europe, the group left destruction in their wake. At Constantinople, the emperor tried to convince them to wait until the more experienced soldiers arrived, but the group were restless and eventually ferried them into enemy territory. The People's Crusade crossed the Bosporus in August. It would be entirely wiped out by the end of October. In the Seljuk Empire, Sultan Kilij Arslan had heard news of a grand army coming from Europe. It sounded like a serious threat. There were rebellions in other parts of this land, but when he heard the Europeans had arrived in Civitate, he turned his attention there. The People's Crusade were no match for the Sultan's army. It had already been broken into two parts, which were competing against each other over who would get the best treasure from looted towns and castles. A German contingent would take control of an abandoned castle, which was soon besieged by the Seljuks. The group were quickly defeated. Messages were sent to the rest of the crusade, claiming to be from the German group boasting about their success. This spurred on the French and Italian contingent, who walked directly into another ambush and were swiftly defeated. The Sultan assumed that this group of peasants was the Grand Army that he'd been warned about. It was easy to believe the rumors had gotten out of control, and the Europeans were nothing to worry about. He turned his attention back to defeating rebellions in another part of his land. When the actual First Crusade arrived, there was no Seljuk army in sight. Kilij Arslan had heard that the group had arrived and were making their way to Nicaea, but he assumed it would just be like the last group he defeated and weren't a priority. It's impossible to say how successful the First Crusade would have been if they didn't get this head start. But considering how close the fighting came at times, it's possible that history would have gone in a very different direction without the People's Crusade. In a strange historical coincidence, January 28th held two important events in the history of the Tudor dynasty. There were a total of 3 Tudor kings, but only 2 had a significant impact on the history of England. One brought an end to civil war that cost the lives of many nobles and members of the royal family, while the other changed the state's religion, which caused even more chaos than the previous war. It was on January 28, 1457, that Henry Tudor was born. Nobody at the time realized this was a significant event. Henry was a descendant of King Edward III, but he was far down the line of succession. That connection to the royal family came through his mother, who was herself the great-great-granddaughter of the 14th century king. He had a closer connection to the more recent King Henry VI, who was his father's half-brother, but they shared the same mother who wasn't herself in the royal line. Even in peaceful times, his birth wouldn't have gained much attention, but he was actually born in the middle of the War of the Roses. This was a battle between the Lancastrians, which was Henry VI's side of the family, and the Yorkists, who were descendants from Edward III's 4th child. It was a dangerous time to be part of the royal family. Henry's father had been in prison before he was born, and passed away due to sickness that he picked up during the time just a few months before Henry was born. Many other members of the royal family lost their lives, and eventually Henry became one of the last descendants of Edward III alive. At the age of 28, he faced Yorkist King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. His marriage to Richard's niece, Elizabeth of York, had already been arranged, and it was a combination of Lancastrian and Yorkish forces who were against Richard, who fought to put the young Henry on the throne. Richard lost his life in the fighting, and Henry emerged victorious to be named Henry VII of England. Henry VII was king for 24 years. At that time, he had many children, but only 2 sons who survived childhood. His oldest son and heir, Arthur, wouldn't survive much longer and passed away at the age of 15. This meant his second son, also named Henry, would be the one to take the throne when he passed away. Henry VIII is one of the most famous Tudor monarchs, even though, like his father, nobody expected him to be king when he was born. Today, he's most well known for having 6 wives in an effort to produce a legitimate heir to the throne. and for changing England's state religion from Catholicism to the Church of England. This switch would cause problems, especially after his daughters succeeded him to the throne. His two oldest children were from two different marriages. Mary was raised Catholic, while Elizabeth was a Protestant, and each queen made efforts to promote their own faith. But that wouldn't come until after Henry VIII passed away. This day came on January 28, 1547, 90 years to the day after his father was born. Harry Glicken isn't a name that's well known by most people, but he's remembered as one of only 2 U.S. volcanologists to have perished in a volcanic eruption. In a strange coincidence, he narrowly avoided his fate 11 years earlier. Glicken was fascinated by science at an early age and graduated from Stanford University in 1980. One of the first roles he earned after graduation was at the United States Geological Survey, monitoring Mount St. Helens. The Washington volcano had started to show signs of activity in March, and this was one of the best chances the USGS had gotten to study an active volcano. Monitoring stations were set up just outside the red zone, an area that had been cleared of all activity. Volcanologist David Johnston had helped to determine where these zones would be placed. He was an experienced scientist and focused his works on the gases emitted by volcanoes. Johnston was a pioneer in his field, and he was looking forward to getting valuable data from Mount St. Helens to help further the scientific understanding. Johnston was a mentor for Glicken during Glicken's time with the USGS, but this was only temporary work for Glicken. He was already a graduate student at the University of California and was looking at other work he could do while studying. At the start of May of 1980, Glicken was stationed at the observation post Coldwater 2. He was there for 2 weeks, but had an interview for other work on May 18th. The day before, Johnston came up to the post to relieve him so that he could go to the interview. Before he left, he snapped a photo. It was early on the morning of May 18th that Mount St. Helens erupted. The eruption completely changed the shape of the mountain and caused destruction far beyond the red zone. Almost immediately, Coldwater 2 was covered in ash and debris, claiming Johnston's life. Glicken helped to investigate the eruption and focused his research on the type of avalanche that would have taken his life if it had occurred just a day earlier. Like Johnston, Glicken would become an expert in this particular niche of volcanology. After earning his doctorate, he spent time traveling to study volcanoes around the world. Japan was a particular interest for him. By 1991, he was working as a research professor and translator at Tokyo Metropolitan University. The previous year, Mount Unzen had started to show signs of activity after being dormant for hundreds of years. Surprisingly, Glicken told friends he wasn't too interested in going to see the volcano in person. He said that Japanese TV provided great coverage, and he didn't need to go see it for himself. But in May of 1991, he was contacted by Katia and Maurice Kraft. These French volcanologists were known for recording footage from the danger zones of active volcanoes, so other volcanologists could better study these volatile phenomena. He agreed to act as their translator and expert on Mount Unzen, as they went in search of footage of a pyroclastic flow. On June 3rd, the 3 volcanologists were in the danger zone when a lava dome collapsed and pyroclastic flow was sent down the valley towards them at about 60 miles an hour. None would survive. Today, both Johnston and Glicken are tied by their similar fates and the eerie coincidence that postponed Glicken's. Charles Darwin is a name many people have heard. His theory of evolution changed how many people look at the world around us and led to many discoveries in the field. Less well known is the name Alfred Russel Wallace, though most biogeographers will know him for the famous Wallace Line that separates the Australian and Asian biological realms. But while Darwin was still working on his famous theory, Wallace made the same discovery. Even Darwin remarked on how strange the coincidence was. Darwin famously got his idea for natural selection during the survey voyage on HMS Beagle. The voyage took Darwin around the world, but it was on the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America that Darwin had his eureka moment. This voyage took place in the early 1930s, and Darwin returned back to England in 1836 with a wealth of specimens to examine and further develop his theory. But even as Darwin went into more detail about the concept of natural selection, he didn't publish anything on his ideas. Over 20 years passed, and Darwin didn't go public with any of his ideas. The concept that one species could change into another was controversial. Darwin's explanation for the mechanism behind it could have seemed absurd to many, and it still does today to some. He wanted to make sure that any possible hole in his theory could be explained before publishing anything. But even as he worked on this theory, Darwin was talking to other natural scientists and published papers on subjects such as geology. One of the people Darwin exchanged letters with was Alfred Wallace. Wallace was a Welsh-born scientist who was in Southeast Asia at the time. He was known for his extensive collection of specimens from around the world. In particular, he had a large collection of bird and butterfly specimens, some of which had never been seen by Europeans. Sometime in early 1858, the idea of natural selection came to Wallace while he was in bed with a fever. He wrote a short paper on the subject, and in April of 1958, he sent it to Darwin. Darwin was in England at the time, and it took several months for the letter to arrive. When it did, Darwin commented on how many phrases in the letters he'd already used as chapter titles on the book that he'd been writing, and thought that it was a remarkable coincidence. Wallace's theory was the push that Darwin needed to start publishing his own work. Wallace's paper was published along with Darwin's on the subject before Darwin published the remainder of his work. Years later, people began to speculate that this was more than just a coincidence. They believed that Darwin had stolen ideas from Wallace. It was believed that Wallace had actually sent his paper to Darwin a month earlier, and the more famous scientist had kept it in secret until he had adapted his own work. But in 2012, scholars were able to trace the ship that would have brought Darwin the letter. The day before Darwin claimed the letter arrived, a ship from the island of Ternate had docked in London. If Darwin had made up the date, it's unlikely he would have picked one so perfect. Wallace was also replying to a letter sent from Darwin the month before, and it's unlikely he would have sent this any sooner than April. The independent discoveries were nothing more than a coincidence, and the two scientists built on the knowledge that was already available to both. It's often said that science fiction can go on to inspire the reality of future scientific endeavors, but it's rare that fiction and fact line up quite as closely as in the case of two Jules Verne novels. Verne was a French writer, famous for adventure novels like Journey to the Center of the Earth and Around the World in 80 Days. Verne put a particular focus on the science side of his novels. What can seem like incredible prophecies today were actually the result of good scientific and mathematical knowledge. The 1865 book, From the Earth to the Moon, is famous for these coincidences. The novel tells the story of a Baltimore club of weapons enthusiasts and is set shortly after the American Civil War. The club members are disappointed that there isn't a war on the horizon for them to test the latest technology, and claim that the war is good for the development of these new weapons. With the world apparently living peacefully now, the characters decide to come up with a new project to develop the technology and create the most devastating weapon possible, a cannon that can hit the moon. The original plan is changed so that the projectile will carry with it 3 people and return to Earth after the trip to the lunar surface. A cannon named Columbiad is set up in central Florida and fires the capsule with 3 people inside to the moon. After the mission, the capsule lands back on Earth, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean before the astronauts are rescued by the US Navy. 100 years later, the details of Verne's story would be eerily reflected in reality. The entire Apollo project had some strange similarities with the characters from the novel. NASA launched their rockets from central Florida. The command module in the Apollo 11 mission was named Columbia, which was very similar to the cannon Columbiad. It carried even 3 people, just like the capsule in the novel. The mathematics in the book also lined up with what NASA scientists would use a century after Verne's book was published. Verne also predicted weightlessness in space and the use of aluminum. These predictions are more than simple coincidences, though. To launch a projectile from the moon, the takeoff location would need to be somewhere near the equator, below the 28th parallel. Only Florida and Texas were reasonable possibilities, as Verne highlights in the book. Verne chose Florida as it was less densely populated, the same reason NASA picked it when the space program began. Aluminum was another choice that both Verne and NASA picked based on scientific information Verne also had access to. Even the choice of the name Columbia was less of a coincidence, as the staff at NASA were partially inspired by the name of Verne's cannon. The The biggest prediction Verne made was that it would be the United States that became the first people to put humans on the moon. Verne could have picked somewhere like the United Kingdom, France, or Japan, all of which were powerful nations at the time the novel was written. The choice of the US is a much stranger coincidence than the scientific details. Verne picked the US in part for a satirical take on the US military-industrial complex. 100 years later, the Apollo missions had a military purpose as well as a scientific one, as they developed technology that would be used in the event of a nuclear war. Even the timing is a strange coincidence. From the Earth to the Moon takes place in the aftermath of the Civil War, while the Apollo missions took place in the aftermath of the Second World War. Together, the similarities between fiction and reality are in part due to scientific knowledge, but also some chilling coincidences. A common myth regarding tornadoes is that they never strike the same place twice. Like lightning, this is completely false, something the residents of a small town in Kansas know too well. In the early 20th century, the town of Codell in northern Kansas was home to around 300 people. It was a small farming community, one of many that had appeared in the Great Plains since the Homestead Act. It had its own school, churches, and business district, but was generally the same as any other town in the area. Around 7 p.m. on May 20th, 1916, a tornado formed 3 miles south of Codell. A spinning funnel of clouds was traveling in a northeast direction, picking up momentum as it went. The storm brushed along the eastern edge of the town, destroying farm buildings that lay on the outskirts of Codell. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, but the damage was estimated to cost about $12,000. The people of Codell started to rebuild. Tornadoes were nothing new in the area. Even today, this part of the United States is still often hit by destructive weather phenomena, especially in the spring and summer months. A year later, the town's residents were still rebuilding after the destruction, but it was something that they'd put behind them. But on the evening of May 20th, 1917, another storm struck the town. This tornado was more devastating than the first. Using the Fujita scale, the first tornado had been an F2, while the second measured 1 step higher at F3. It was the early evening again when this tornado formed. For a second year in a row, the disaster swept past the outer edge of the town. This time, the western edge of the town was hit. Those who'd been lucky a year earlier were now the ones more likely to be hit. Again, nobody was hurt, and the town started to rebuild. People started to refer to May 20th as Cyclone Day, as the weather phenomenon was commonly known as cyclones at the time. But it was nothing more than a joke, and nobody expected the same thing to happen again exactly 1 year later, in 1918. For a town to be hit by tornadoes 2 years in a row was unlucky, but not impossible, especially as Codell was located in such a hotspot for the phenomenon. Its happening on the same day was less likely, and a strange coincidence. But the idea that one might happen again on May 20th seemed to be a statistical impossibility. Residents of Codell managed to make it through most of May 20th, 1918 with no sign of any storms. But late in the evening, signs of another thunderstorm were spotted. A tornado rapidly formed, bringing with it lightning and hail. This time, the tornado struck the heart of the town. It was also 1 step higher on the Fujita scale, ranking F4. This was the second highest rank on the old intensity scale. Not only did it destroy buildings, but 10 people and countless farm animals lost their lives. This time, rebuilding was much harder. The town school was reconstructed, but many people started to leave Codell. Even though May 20th has been tornado-free since then, the town is now mostly a ghost town, with less than 50 people calling the town home. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.